Welcome to Literary Dialogs with Nina Serrano, bringing you wonderful poets and writers who focus on peace, justice, and a healthy planet. I'm your host, Nina Serrano. My guest today is Lucille Lang, and I'm going to focus on her recent book, Birds of San Pancho and Other Poems of Place. Welcome, Lucille Lang.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. It's been years since we've done an interview. I remember interviewing you about your memoir, Married at 14. And also, I remember very pleasant times where we exchanged poems at poetry readings.
And very pleasant times reading together, too.
Yes.
Like at generations of poetry.
I'd love to hear some poems from Birds of San Pancho and Other Poems of Place, a book that I've enjoyed quite a bit, both in my serious session, 2 sessions to read the whole book, and then many times of browsing through it just for the pure pleasure of it. So could we begin with one of the poems?
Okay, I'll start out reading the title of a poem from the book, Birds of San Pancho. This takes place in the state of Nayarit, Mexico. A great kiskadee appears early in this poem, and this is a great kiskadee on the cover of the book. So, Birds of San Pancho. A great kiskadee sits on the casa wall, belting its exuberant song above the dusty cobblestone street. The bird is masked like a raccoon, its breast yellow as the butterflies that flit amid hibiscus and bougainvillea. Far from the casa, where palms and Maya nut trees grow lushly, a yellow-winged cacique waits in the paperbark tree, the lemony underside of its long tail cascading like silk. It surveys the scene, ignoring the golden-cheeked woodpecker, streak-backed oriole, flycatchers, and scrub euphonia sharing the selva. Farther down the dirt road, where red ants live inside acacia thorns, a pale cow wanders alone, snubbing the fat chachalacas, singing chachalaca as I pass by. It seems the birds are out to cheer me, though I know food and mates are what they're after. A whole flock of orange-fronted parakeets feasts on berries overhead. Later, at the lagoon, a great blue heron, a little blue heron, a green heron, a night heron, 2 great egrets, 8 snowy egrets, and 20 cattle egrets gather while brown pelicans dive for fish and the sun's bright disk sinks into the sea. When it disappears, the egrets rise in groups and pairs to settle in 2 coconut palms for the night. Oh, to sit up there too, safe, having eaten my fill, with folded wings, watching over creation.
Thank you. That's one of the things that I love about your poetry. Its combination of your science background and your poet's heart, that the poet can feel herself in the tree as a bird, and yet that you can name so specifically the species of birds. That's marvelous, and I really admire it. Your training is both as a poet with advanced degrees in poetry and as a scientist. What kind of scientist are you?
I trained as a biologist. I got my bachelor's degree in biological sciences, and then I went on to earn a master's degree in zoology with a specialization in cell biology, although I did have to take some courses, fortunately, where I got to go out and look at animals in nature. And then I earned my PhD in science and mathematics education.
Well, that certainly has been wonderful for you in poetry. It supports your poetry. It gives so much strength, the specificity of your actually naming things specifically like that.
Thank you. Well, as it turns out, in San Pancho, the birds are different from the birds in California. And I wouldn't have been able to identify all of those birds without the help of a local expert, Luis Morales Bayin, who is the director of the San Pancho Birding Network. And I had the great good fortune to go birding with him when I was in San Pancho.
That is good fortune. I was wondering about San Pancho. At first, I thought it was a mythical place because it's a nickname, Pancho, instead of Francisco.
The actual name of the city in Mexico is San Francisco, but they don't call it San Francisco because everybody thinks of San Francisco, California. San Francisco, Mexico is a very tiny town. And so they gave it the nickname San Pancho.
That's also the nickname of San Francisco here in California, in the Chicano community.
Oh,
very often people will say, yeah, San Pancho, or at least back in the 60s. You have more poems for us.
Poem that I wrote in San Pancho that I would like to read, my Dream Hologram. Should I read that?
Oh, please.
Okay. Hologram. In my dream, my daughter shimmered on stage as a hologram, giving a lecture on sexual dysfunction for her fellow marriage and family therapists. They nodded and laughed at all the right times. I wanted to tell them she was such a terrific speaker, so witty and animated, because she'd studied dramatic art. I knew that she knew she had cancer, but expected to live. Only I knew she was already dead. No way would I tell her and break her heart. She was still my baby who'd bounced in time to the music of the Beatles, my mischievous toddler, my girl who sang on stage at Fairyland at 5. Waking to the sea's murmur at Casa Obelisco in San Pancho, Mexico, in my room with the cool tile floor and a fan turning slowly overhead, I understood this was what had happened. Through all the long months of chemo, R-CHOP, rice, R-DHAP, Gemox, PET scans, and radiation treatments, both of us snubbed death, the hated stranger grinning smugly, waiting so near. Even as the tissues around her lungs filled with fluid from the tumor and her breathing grew labored, I held her hand and told her over and over, hang on to hope, Leanna. You can still get better, as though my love could scratch a diamond or hold back the night.
So beautiful, so painful. I remember from our interview about your memoir, Married at 14, the birth of Liana.
Yes, she was born when I was 15, as you know.
Yes, it's a pain, I'm sure, that never goes away.
That's right. It doesn't go away, but one learns to live with it. And Leanna, when Leanna died, she left 2 beautiful children who were 8 and 10 years old at the time. Now they're 15 and 17. And so my love for her is extended to them. And they don't replace her, but it's wonderful that she still exists through them.
Yes, and that mother love exists for them through you. I also remember that we did a poetry reading where you read from a book that you had just written, Ancestors and Descendants, where you talk about them.
That's right. Yes. Yeah, my previous poetry book, which came out in 2015, was called Becoming an Ancestor. And it's about ancestors, my contemporary family, and morality. And that book too contains poems about Leanna's death.
And you have other poems for us?
Yes, I do. So this book, Birds of San Pancho, is divided into two sections. And the first section is called Foreigner. And those poems take place in various countries of Latin America and Europe. And then the second section is called Between the Two Shining Seas. And those poems take place in the US. So the two poems that I've read so far are both in the Foreigner section. They take place in Mexico. That's where I had my dream about Leanna. So I will read another poem from that first section of the book that takes place in a town in southern France. And this is called Abandoned in Sarlat. My husband drove away, leaving me on Boulevard Eugène Leroy in Sarlat, France, on a May morning, near the Hotel Madeleine, with its blue shutters and saffron stones. I wondered if I'd taken too long in the bathroom that morning or made too much noise typing on my computer the night before. Walking around the corner to Rue de la République, I didn't have the heart to browse at La Lune Enchantée with its figurines, masks, and little jewelry boxes in the window. The Loi Blanche with brightly colored scarves out front, or even Maison Pellegrini, which boasted selling Maigret de Canard Gras since 1890. Trying not to panic, I contemplated the monument inscribed Aux enfants de Sarlat, morts pour la patrie, 1914 to 1918. And the one that said Aux héros de la libération de l'arrondissement de Sarlat, 1940 to 1945. Which stood behind a fountain surrounded by grass and yellow, white, and orange flowers. Later, my husband said he'd spotted a parking place but couldn't fit our rental car into it. Then he got lost, couldn't find his way back to me or even to our B&B, Le Jardin. Still, I wept, remembering that men and boys died in those wars and women waited whose husbands never returned.
That's a beautiful poem. I think I have experienced similar.
Did you get stranded somewhere by your husband?
Or you feel that you're stranded. I mean, I'm sure your husband did turn up because here you are.
You're right. It was we didn't reconnect. I lost him at 11 that morning and I didn't see him again until 7 o'clock that night.
Oh.
So it was really crazy.
Oh, mine was nowhere that frightening. Just maybe waiting 20 minutes or something. Tears of abandonment came because of being in a foreign place. And I wondered about that the title of the book is Birds of San Pancho and Other Poems of Place. So I assumed that the book would be divided into two, and that one part would be Birds of San Pancho, and the other part would be Other Poems of Place. But instead, you called the first part Foreigner, and the second part From Sea to Shining Sea. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I think of the book of all of the poems are poems of place. And some of them in the second part of the book, the place could be my own house even, or the place could be an airplane. But I see both parts of the book as being poems of place. And I just felt like Birds of San Pancho, that particular poem was emblematic of the whole book because of the specificity of place and trying to recapture place and what I was seeing there. And also because it's a book that celebrates the natural world, and there are a lot of nature poems in the book, and also poems about ecological issues like pollution, and also many poems in which other birds appear.
Yes, the natural world is definitely one of the themes of your poetry, and always very beautifully handled. So would you like to continue sharing?
Okay. I think I'll read one more poem that takes place from that trip to southern France, when my husband inadvertently left me in Sarlat. And I should say that it later became clear that he was developing some memory problems. And that was why he was just unable to find his way back to me or the B&B or anything. Okay, so this one is called Child's Grave and Finery. A 10,000-year-old grave of a child about 3 years old, covered with ochre dust and marked with 3 stones, nestled in a rock shelter under an overhanging cliff in southern France. More than 1,500 beads carefully carved from seashells and animal teeth adorned his neck, wrists, elbows, ankles, and knees. Marks inside the beads show a needle passed through them. They were sewn onto clothes that disintegrated long ago. Scratches and nicks on the outside imply the child wore these beaded clothes while he was playing. Anthropologists say this finery must signify hereditary social status, but maybe he was an only child whose grandmother polished the beads and sewed them onto his clothes while his father hunted and his mother gathered berries, the way a grandmother today might knit or crochet a sweater or blanket. Or maybe his parents were so broken by his death that they sewed all their own beads onto his burial clothes, so anyone finding his grave would know how much he mattered.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, so I took that trip to southern France. It was just 2 years after Leanna died, and I wept. I wept at the museum where I saw the skeleton of this little boy who had died so long ago, and I empathized for his parents.
That definitely came through that poem. Do you have more?
Yeah, so I'll move ahead now to the section Between the Two Shining Seas, the poems that take place in the US. And the first one I'll read is called Names of the States. Alabama, for the Alabama tribe, forced from Alabama to Texas when white people claimed their land in 1805. Alaska, the Aleut word Alyeska, meaning mainland, the place toward which the sea flows. Arizona, the word for small spring in the Owatum language of a Southwest desert people who couldn't vote until 1948. Arkansas, another name for the Quapaws, the downstream people who were removed to Oklahoma from their ancestral lands. Connecticut, from the Algonquian word for long river place. Delaware, from Baron de la Warr, Virginia's first governor, whose name rechristened the local Lenni Lenape, the first tribe to sign a treaty with the US. Hawaii, for Hawaii Loa, discoverer of the islands in Polynesian myth. Idaho, maybe Shoshone, for the sun comes down the mountain, or the Apache name for the Comanches who drove them from the southern plains. Illinois, a French transliteration of Illinois, the Ojibwe word for the Anoka, whose 13 tribes were reduced to 5 by European disease. Indiana, land of the Indians, the Delaware, Piankashaw, Kickapoo, Wea, Shawnee, Miami, and Potawatomi, who were mostly removed by 1846. Iowa, from the Dakota word for the Iowa tribe, meaning sleepy ones. Kansas, the Dakota word for the South Wind people, whose last fluent speaker of the Kansa language died in 1983. Kentucky, derived from the Iroquoian word for on the meadow. Massachusetts, people of the Great Hills, that is the Blue Hills south of Boston Harbor, who were decimated by smallpox in 1633. Michigan, from Michigamaa, great water, in the language of the Ojibwe, who, like so many others, didn't understand the treaties ceding their land. Minnesota, from Minnesota, the name the Dakotas gave the Minnesota River, whose clear blue water reflected clouds. Mississippi, from Mississippi, Ojibwe for the great river along which more than 20 tribes lived and fished. Missouri, for the Missouria tribe that lived on the Missouri River, a Siouan people whose name means town of the big canoes. Nebraska, from Nebraska, the Omaha word for broad water, a description of the Platte River by which the tribe lived. New Mexico, named for the Mexicas, a Nahuatl-speaking people who ruled the Aztec Empire until the Spanish conquered them in 1519. North and South Dakota, named for a Sioux tribe whose men were sentenced in 1862 to the largest mass execution in US history, though Dakota means friend. Ohio, from Ohio, continuously giving river in the language of the Senecas, whose land was flooded in 1965 following construction of Kanzua Dam. Oklahoma, from Oklahoma, Choctaw for red people, a name proposed by the chief of the Choctaw Nation during treaty negotiations in 1866. Oregon, maybe from Warrigon, an Algonquian word for beautiful river, but so many native words and languages have been lost that it's hard to say. Tennessee, for the Cherokee town Tanasi, a village on the Little Tennessee River until the Cherokees were marched to Oklahoma along the Trail of Tears. Texas, meaning friends or allies in the language of the Caddos, who were removed to Oklahoma in 1859. Utah, from Utahai, an Apache word meaning people of the mountains. Wisconsin, from Mesconsing, the name for the Wisconsin River in the Miami language, river running through a red place. Wyoming, a contraction of Mechi-Weemeeing, a Delaware word first used for a valley in Pennsylvania, meaning at the Big Plains. And yes, every part of this land is Indian country, from forest to desert, mountain to prairie, Manhattan to Yosemite, Tallahassee to Seattle, all the fields, rivers, hills, and canyons between the two shining seas.
That is an amazing poem, Lucy. How through a list, you're able to tell the entire history, the horrible, bloody story. You have the deep connection yourself to the native people.
Yes, my mother was 1/4 Wampanoag, from Massachusetts.
And how did you go about researching this poem? It meant,
Well, I knew that a few of the states were named for indigenous words and the tribes of North America. And so I started Googling the history of all the state names, and I, it was just I thought, my God, I couldn't believe it. But most of the state names are references to the American Indians or come from indigenous words or the names of tribes.
and they reveal a horrible history.
It was really a story of genocide, and a story that really has been suppressed, starting with the myth that Columbus discovered America. Hello, there were people here for at least 12,000 years before he arrived. He didn't discover America, he invaded America. And the people who came after him weren't kindly settlers. They were conquerors who were conquering the people who were here first, and who were much better stewards of the land.
And you've done a lot of organizing around this through your poetry.
Yes, I've also co-edited an anthology called Red Indian Road West, Native American Poetry from California. And I've organized a lot of readings. And that book tells a lot about the history of Native American people in California, both the tribes that are indigenous to California and the others who've ended up here. Because as it turns out, California has the largest Native American population of any state in the US, more than Oklahoma or any other place where you know that there are a lot of Native Americans living. And one reason is that during the 50s and early 60s, I think it actually started in the 40s, the US government had a tribal relocation and termination program where they were determined to remove the people from the reservations, give them some money, resettle them in cities throughout the US, and then take back the land. And so what came down was that there were a lot of people who were relocated, and two big relocation centers were in San Francisco and Los Angeles. So a lot of people from tribes throughout the US ended up in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and their descendants are still here. So that was, but one more thing about this tribal termination policy was that all of the tribes except one that were terminated eventually were reinstated. There were lawsuits, and this in the end, this policy did not fly, but it redistributed the Native American population, and a lot of people left the reservations. So that's one way people came here. And then, in California, because of the economy, the universities, a lot of Native American people have come here for jobs or to study. And so as a result, we have more Native Americans than any other state. And I think it's something to be proud of.
I agree. Something to be proud of, as are the poem that you wrote. That is something to be proud of, because it has so much history and so little preaching.
Yeah, basically, I'm just telling exactly what happened. So I'll read another poem. This is called "What Flows into the Gulf of Mexico." Melted snow from the crests of the Rockies rushes past pinyon pines, limber pines, lodgepole pines, cork bark firs, ponderosas gathering silt as it reaches bur oaks, cottonwoods, staghorn sumacs. Silver maples passes prairie cordgrass, winds through cattails, duckweed, skunk cabbage, finally to mingle in the Mississippi with water draining from 31 states where hunter-gatherers lived with bison herds for 10,000 years. Now the river carries oven cleaner, human feces and caffeine, medical residue from hospitals and laboratories, scouring powder, and soap from millions of homes, antibiotics from all the cattle ranches in the Midwest, solvents from farm machinery plants, pesticides from corn and soybean fields, ingredients used to make plastic, enough estrogen from birth control pills to bend the genders of fish, thousands of tons of herbicides, fertilizers that cause algae to form massive green carpets in the Gulf, which leads to an explosion of bacteria that decompose algae and kill everything in an area the size of Massachusetts each year. All this even before 206 million gallons of oil from the Deepwater Horizon blowout, before hundreds of thousands of gallons of oil dispersant containing chemicals that destroy red blood cells and cause cancer. It all enters the shimmering, translucent bodies of arrowworms and dinoflagellates consumed by oysters, the algae scooped up and eaten by shrimp, the crabs that crush mollusks and shrimp with their chelipeds, the sea bass whose stout jaws clamp down on any smaller creature. Of course, it's in our hearts and permeates our brains as surely as hope or anger. It's in your body and mine, these molecules that cling like lovers to our bones.
Cling like lovers to our bones, all of these horrible things that will kill us and harm us.
That's right. And and I don't write this to say, that this is hopeless. Look how we've destroyed the world. I write it to say, this really needs to be changed. We need to have a different kind of different farming practices. We need to have different methods of waste disposal, hopefully, that involve recycling and breaking down toxic chemicals instead of just spewing them as is into the environment, because science can take care of this. We don't have to live so destructively on the planet. We don't have to clear cut forests. We don't have to fill the Mississippi River with toxins. We don't have to let so many species go extinct. We can live differently, and science can help us do that. We can send people to the moon. We can develop a vaccine for this horrible coronavirus in just 1 year. Actually, it was less than a year from the time the coronavirus pandemic started to the time that the first vaccinations were given. So, science can do amazing things, and it really needs to be used for the common good of people and of the planet.
Well, I hear that in your poetry. I hear the hope in these poems.
Good. I'm glad the hope comes through. So I'd like to read a happy poem now.
Go for it.
Not all my poems are gloom and doom. This one is called I Am Amazed. I am amazed by the Arches cluster, the most crowded place in the Milky Way, jam-packed with stars 25,000 light years from Earth and Sagittarius. By Earth whirling through space, the only planet known to have free oxygen, liquid water, whales, wallabies, and redwood forests. By a single redwood tree 350 feet tall and 10 feet in diameter, standing above the Pacific, since Herod was exiled to Gaul. By a single redwood needle flat with two silvery bands on its underside and inner machinery endlessly churning out ATP. By a molecule of ATP, which carries energy in all the cells of people and trees, a currency required for love and breathing. By two children, a boy and a girl, playing under the tree, who spot a speckled woodpecker with a red patch on its head, tapping the bark, igniting a blaze of amazement.
Amazing.
So I'll say that poem is dedicated to the Berkeley art ambassador, artist Susan Duhan Felix, who always signs her correspondence, "Stay Amazed." And I originally wrote that to read at one of her birthday parties. And under the acknowledgments in my book, I explain that that poem is dedicated to her.
What I like so much about this poem is, and the one that you just read before that, is that they are about your love of science, your hope for science, your belief that science can help us out of this mess.
Yeah, it can help us out of this mess, and it can help us to understand this mess. And it just helps us to, I believe science helps us to understand everything. You know, it helps us to understand the planet Earth, the universe, our own position here, our relationship to all of the other animals. And I think it's one important part of our understanding.
That's why I love that you're a scientist, that you bring your science into the poetry, because it kind of releases the love. It offers a practical avenue to express it.
If I had it to do over again, I would try. I think you can learn a lot of science from poetry, and you can also inspire people through poetry to be interested in science and to go learn more from a book or museum or course. And so if I had it to do over again, I would do my doctoral dissertation in science education on the role of poetry and the role that poetry can play in learning and appreciating science. But anyhow, I finished that in 1979. I did it on teaching investigative skills in biology. But that doesn't stop me from using poetry as a tool to bring science to people now.
Well, I'm so glad that you do, because this is what we need. We need practical and hopeful ways out. And now we finally have an opportunity again after this election, now that we've gotten rid of Trump, who hated science and actively worked against it.
I know, that was so horrible. It was very disheartening for me. But now we've got somebody who understands the significance of science and believes in science. We've got a much more knowledgeable president. And I hope that we can hang on to the House and the Senate in 2022 so that he can have the Congress who can work with him on all of his policies.
Yes, that will be wonderful.
That's my hope. So
Mine
I
too.
wanted to read another poem called Toys in My House. I write a lot of family poems as well as science poems and nature poems and poems. So this is a poem where the place in my title, Poems of Place, the place is my own house. And this is called Toys in My House. On the stereo cabinet in the living room, a black metal steam engine my grandfather, who came to California from Paterson, New Jersey by train, played with in the 1880s when women wore bustles and every year more and more tracks were laid. 84 glass marbles in multicolored swirling shades in a handmade beige cotton sack on which my dad neatly printed his initials, RAL, before the stock market crash, when the Charleston was the rage. Perched on a closet shelf, the Keystone televiewer I used to see naked children in 3D outside their tree-like huts in the Belgian Congo, back when blondes were called dumb and people still did the jitterbug. The Candyland game, whose plastic gingerbread people my daughter Leanna pushed through the lollipop woods when Tricky Dick was president and hippies danced to the dead, high on mushrooms or weed. A doll, once Swan Lake Barbie with long blonde tresses, but who got tattoos and short spiky hair, purple, pink, and green, thanks to my daughter Tamarind when Pac-Man was new and Michael Jackson ruled MTV. Buzz Lightyear, waiting for someone new to come along, flip up his helmet and hear him say, "To infinity and beyond," now that my grandson Brandon, almost 12, would rather play Jetpack Joyride on his iPod. The miniature horse ranch set with white, chestnut, gray, and tan steeds, whose jockeys ride them over hurdles in the hands of my granddaughters, Autumn and Sabine, who still are masters of make-believe. A plastic car that plays the Mickey Mouse Club song for Devlin, my younger grandson, who scoots around the living room, unaware that the world will change, just glad to toot the horn today.
These have been wonderful poems. Wonderful.
Thank you.
You're so active. I'm sure you're writing new things and organizing new books of poetry. What are some of your current projects?
Well, I'd like to do a book of new and selected poems, selecting poems from my published poetry collections, as well as uncollected poems that have not only written since Birds of San Pancho came out, but there were always poems that didn't fit into the various collections. And so I would like to publish new and selected poems. And I also have 3 partially completed prose manuscripts. One is a memoir about my daughter Leanna, focusing on her life. And another one is a book of personal essays, and another one is a book of short stories. And all of these books are, I would say between 1/3 and 1/2 completed. And so I'm hoping I can finish them.
How can people get your book, Birds of San Pancho, and other poems of place?
It's available online. Blue Light Press, my publisher, does not sell directly, but it is available through places online like Amazon and Bookshop.
Oh, thank you. So the name of the book is Birds of San Pancho and Other Poems of Place, and you can get it online or maybe order it through your favorite independent bookstore.
That's another way to do it. Yeah, you can definitely order it through an independent bookstore.
It's beautiful work, it's knowledgeable work, and it's filled with hope and love. And that's what we really need right now. So thank you so much, Lucille Lang Day, for this conversation and for sharing these wonderful and inspiring poems.
Thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed sharing the poems with you. And I can't wait till we can see each other in person again and I can give you a hug.
Yes, that will be the day.